Ms. Rebecca Cooper is a graduate student researcher specializing in neuroimaging and mental health. She completed a bachelor's degree in biomedicine with first-class honors at the University of Melbourne, as well as a master's in prosthetics and orthotics at La Trobe University. And Ms. Cooper is currently pursuing her PhD in psychiatry at the University of Melbourne. And today, she will be presenting findings from an exciting study that uses data from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development study to model the changes in sleep across the transition into adolescence, a period which is characterized by significant changes in sleep behavior. So the study also assessed the change and stability in sleep behavior in relation to emerging psychopathology symptoms during this key period in development. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Cooper.
Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca and I'm from Melbourne Neuropsychiatry Centre within the University of Melbourne. Today I'm going to be discussing sleep patterns in late childhood and adolescence and longitudinal relationships with psychopathology. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of my co-authors as listed here. And in addition, I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples where I'm presenting from today and the lands on which they are custodians of. So that is the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Now, when we focus on the transition from childhood into the early adolescence, we see that sleep disturbances are relatively prevalent. However, for those individuals that do have a relatively high level of sleep disturbances, these individuals also experience high levels of psychopathology. And this is just another term for poor mental health symptoms. Now, why this is really relevant is that individuals with a higher degree of psychopathology symptoms are much more likely to go on to develop a psychiatric illness in later adolescence or into adulthood. Now, if we look at the pattern or the specific sleep disturbances across this transition period, what we see is that these the overall patterns of these sleep disturbances are in a state of flux. So we see a number of sleep disturbances become much less prevalent, and they're shown with the blue arrows there, while others such as insomnia become much more prevalent moving into adolescence. If we look at the psychopathology side of things, we see an overall increase in the experience of psychopathology symptoms, and we also see the onset of many psychiatric disorders during this period. I was really interested in the interplay between these two sorts of trajectories or changes, and I wondered whether they might be somehow interrelated. So the aim of our study was to assess or to investigate the changes in these sleep disturbance patterns further, and then to assess the temporal relationships with changes in psychopathology during this period. Now, data for our study was collected from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or ABCD study for short. This is a longitudinal study currently being run in the US in young adolescents. So we obtained data for just over 10,000 individuals at baseline, and this is when they were between 9 and 11 years of age. We also obtained data at the 2-year follow-up point, so here the individuals are between 11 and 13 years. We obtained a measure for sleep disturbance and psychopathology at each time point, as you can see detailed here. And for our main method of analysis, we utilised an approach known as a latent transition analysis. So for those who are familiar with k-means or clustering analyses, this model works in a very similar manner. But if you're unfamiliar, basically what this model will do is in a given population, it will identify whether there are subgroups of the population within this larger sample that have similar responses to a particular set of variables. So in our study, for example, we inputted the sleep disturbance data at both time points to determine whether there were patterns of different sleep disturbances that might cluster together within particular individuals. So for our results, we found firstly that there were 4 discrete patterns of sleep disturbances that were identified in both late childhood and early adolescence, and I'll just describe those briefly to you. So the first group that we identified were individuals that experienced an overall low level of sleep disturbance. And this, at baseline, this group made up about 26% of the sample. The second group we identified had substantially higher levels, but sort of in the mixed to moderate range in terms of the severity of sleep disturbances that they experienced, and were thus the mixed disturbance. We identified a third group that had, similarly to the first group, a pattern of low levels of sleep disturbance across all symptom scales, with the exception that they had a very high severity of insomnia symptoms. And thus were the insomnia dominant group. And our fourth and final group were individuals that experienced high levels of sleep disturbance across all the different disturbance domains that we analysed. Now, what I find really interesting is that when we repeated this model at the 2-year follow-up, we found that the same overall patterns were experienced by those in early adolescence. However, what did change substantially was the proportion of individuals within each group. So what this graphic shows here is the proportion of individuals within each group that were reclassified into the same group over time, i.e. they didn't change in their sleep patterns over time. So as an example, those in the insomnia dominant group, we had 83% of those that were categorized in this group at baseline remained so in early adolescence. And this graphic also shows the proportion of individuals within each group that transition to a different profile. So for example, 6% of those initially in the insomnia dominant group transitioned to a pattern of high disturbance when they reached early adolescence. When we looked at the cross-sectional relationships with psychopathology, we found that membership in any of the more severe disturbance classes, so that's all of those other than the low disturbance class, were much more likely to develop or to experience symptoms of psychopathology. So what we generally found overall was that high levels of disturbance were associated with high levels of psychopathology, and this is shown in the plot here. So on the vertical axis here, we have all the different symptoms of psychopathology that we assessed in our study, and these odds ratios represent the probability of class membership in any of the 3 more severe sleep disturbance profiles relative to that low disturbance class. What I will point out is that regardless of which symptom we look at in relation to psychopathology, high levels of sleep disturbance were associated with all of these symptoms. So it seems to be a really like a transdiagnostic measure, or sleep disturbances are associated with a broad range of different psychopathology symptoms. When we move on to our longitudinal analysis, first we wanted to ascertain whether psychopathology symptoms at baseline had any influence on the probability of individuals transitioning between sleep patterns over time. So what we're in essence asking is whether these symptoms of psychopathology in late childhood, whether they preceded these changes in sleep that we saw across our study. And we found using logistic regression that there was no relationship between these 2 variables. What we did find, however, was that transition between sleep patterns over time was significantly associated with changes in psychopathology, and what's more, they appeared to co-occur or co-localize over time. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Here I've shown this visually, but what we can see, or to expand this a bit further, what I mean is that individuals that experienced an increase in the overall levels of sleep disturbance over time also experienced increases in psychopathology symptoms. And in reverse, those individuals that experienced a decrease in the sleep disturbances that they were experiencing also experienced a decrease in psychopathology. So to put in layman's terms, when one got worse, the other got worse, and when one got better, the other got better. And it seems to be in a very, we saw this effect mirrored across this timescale that we were assessing for. So just to kind of expand on that further within this graph, what I'm showing is that, for example, individuals in the mixed disturbance group that transitioned to high disturbance over time certainly had an increase in both internalizing and externalizing symptoms. And these are just different subtypes of psychopathology, I should add. While those, for example, that transitioned in the reverse direction, so for example, they began in the high disturbance class at late childhood, but transitioned to a pattern of mixed disturbance, we saw significant decreases in the psychopathology symptoms they experienced. So to wrap up and conclude, we found firstly that there were several discrete patterns of sleep disturbance present in both late childhood and adolescence, and these are in a state of flux over time. And secondly, that psychopathology symptoms do not precede these changes in sleep, but appear to co-localize with them. One interesting implication for these findings, and a field of or a venue for further research, which I'm really keen to look into, is to identify what predictors or what was different in these individuals that improved in sleep versus those that deteriorated in sleep. What kind of predicted those changes? What was the difference between improving or deteriorating? And thus, if we're able to identify some of these predictors, we could utilize these in public health related initiatives, in policy changes, or even in treatment programs for youth that might be at risk in these sorts of samples. Great. Thank you all for listening. Yes, and thanks very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica, for the very, very interesting talk. So we have some questions from the audience right now. So for the first question, yes. So did you consider any moderating or mediating factors for the transition across groups from baseline to 2 years later? For example, gender differences, whereby there is substantial evidence showing that there is significant gender differences between males and females across different psychopathological symptoms.
Thank you for your question. We looked broadly at whether the different classes had a different, whether the classes had different distributions in their sexes, and we found that the insomnia dominant group tended to have more females in it, and that was just at baseline and at follow up. But we didn't look at the moderating effects of changes over time, and we also didn't look at the relationships between the sleep scores and the psychopathology. But previous work that has been done in this data set shows that typically internalizing symptoms are more common in the females, and then in the males, they're more externalizing specific. So we didn't study it in our study, but I know from previous work that's what's been examined.
Okay, right. So another question that's come in is, the emerging patterns were very interesting, and have this been observed in adults or other cohorts of adolescents? And how do these patterns translate to a typically linear sleep screener?
I'm not sure what you mean by the linear sleep screener, but in terms of, this is the first study that's really looked at latent patterns of sleep disturbances and how they change over time. They're not typically done. They're kind of an understudied, kind of a underutilized kind of resource, I think, in terms of the latent modeling field. But I think they do. Other studies have looked at changes in certain sleep disturbances over time, not within a latent modeling or a clustering approach, and have largely shown what we have. So you've got, mixed pattern of disturbances generally tend to decrease over time, but you do see, as I mentioned, that insomnia does increase over time. So there's different studies, or the different methods all kind of converge and show the same pattern that's emerging there, but just in different ways.
Okay, so one last question. Do the switches between discrete patterns cut across gender and race?
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit about the gender before. Race, there was a few, they were relatively small differences. Typically, we saw that, I think, obviously the ABCD data set is a very diverse and very rich in a whole heap of different ethnicities and races. So we were able to look at that. I think there was, if they're individuals identified as being white, they were more likely to be in the higher sleep disturbance classes. But there was no, like, other than that, there was no like specific ethnic or racial kind of patterns that kind of emerged from the data. So the patterns seem to be kind of common across the spectrum of different racial ethnic categories.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for your very, very interesting talk, Rebecca.
No worries. Thank you so much.
I think that's
Thanks
all
for
the questions we
questions.
have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.